Open session on Tuesday, April 12th, 2022 to order. First item 1.1 is approval of minutes from Tuesday, February 15th, 2022. Mayor Riordan and Councillor McKenzie on the question. All those in favor? Motion carried. All right, and item 1.2 is the consent agenda. I'll take a motion to receive and file for information. Mayor Riordan, Councillor Harris, thank you very much. And moving on to item 1.3, we have the Affordable Housing Action Strategy with our presenter, Andy Reid and SHS Consulting. Oh, sorry, pardon me. We'll take an introduction from Phil Ouellette first. Thank you.
Through you, Chair Killen, to the committee, I'm very happy to announce that the Affordable Housing Action Plan is well underway, and we will learn today about the key takeaways from the Housing Needs Assessment, as well as immediate next steps as it relates to the project as we embark into the quote-unquote strategic planning component of the project, which includes comprehensive stakeholder and public engagement. As you may recall from previous briefings and presentations, the strategic plan is modeled through a collective impact approach, which is likely to include actions from the nonprofit sector, private sector, federal and provincial governments, and of course the City of St. John. Andy Reid, who's a registered professional planner and a planner within the Growth and Community Planning team, has recently replaced Mark O'Hearn as the project lead for this project. Mark has taken on a new position within the city. So we are extremely fortunate to have Mr. Reid within our team. For those with longer institutional knowledge, you may recall that Andy was the project lead for the secondary plan for the Central Peninsula and saw it through in early 2020. So with that, I will leave the floor to Andy to give us a little update on the strategic planning exercise.
Thanks for the introduction, Phil. Madam Chair and members of the Growth Committee, we are pleased to provide an update concerning the Affordable Housing Action Plan, a community-based project that will address affordable housing in St. John. I just pause for a moment to say I know it's a topic that everyone's interested in, and I think this project is something that we all really need to just believe in, because it's no doubt it's going to be influencing our long-term plans for many years to come. So to recap the vision for the project is that St. John is a vibrant, inclusive, and thriving community with a diverse range of safe and affordable housing. I'll speak a little bit about the kind of framework of the project. The consultant will cover this as well, but the project is divided into 4 phases. So it's important for you to know that the first and second phases of the project are now completed. The housing needs assessment, which was part of the second phase, is going to be going forward informing the development of the action plan. And our consultants will provide a synopsis of that needs assessment today. During the next phase, and probably the most exciting phase we're entering, which is phase 3, a substantial amount of engagement opportunities are being provided, and this engagement is intended to validate the statistical and demographic analysis of the needs assessment, laying more groundwork for the development of the policy framework and action plan. Just to highlight a number of these engagement initiatives, this week and the previous week, the consultants have been leading 5 theme focus groups, capture a diverse perspectives ranging from the development community to special needs housing. And I've had the opportunity to participate in a number of these focus groups, and so far we've had some really great and pointed discussions. There's no lack of interest and involvement from folks. In addition, the project is listed on the Shape Your City project site, which is now live and collecting additional impact from citizens. A number of ideas have been submitted already. We have a project email address set up, affordable@stjohn.ca, where we're also receiving comments from members of the public. A community survey will be released this month through the Shape Your City project site. We're also working with neighborhood developers to ensure that the surveys are reaching the hardest to reach perspectives in our community through a questionnaire. In addition to the survey, there will be 3 town halls scheduled, and we have dates coming up for the April 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So we will be sending out more communications on that soon. During these engagements, I'd highlight that we are targeting an ever-increasing list of stakeholders. These stakeholders encompass a broad range of interests to ensure this is a truly community-driven plan that will result in a community-driven solutions. Together, these inputs will be critical to inform the Housing Action Plan, which will be an exciting step as we begin to talk about policy, the on-the-ground solutions, and striving to set up the action plan. At the Growth Committee's meeting in June, we will be able to re-engage the committee and share more information about these next steps. So I would thank you for the update, and next up we have Ken Folds and Ed Starr from SHS Consulting. I think Phil's going to give a little introduction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Members of the Growth Committee, my name is Ed Starr. I'm the partner directing the overall project, working together with Andy and the team and the various stakeholders to put the project together. And so today we're going to take you briefly through our work to date and concentrate particularly on the needs assessment and what we found. And I've got with me today Ken Folds. He's the project manager, largely responsible for the day-to-day work and keeping the project moving along and communicating with the city and the stakeholders. And Matt Pipe, who is our housing analyst, who's done a lot of the background research. So Andy, would you be able to move the slides or the Great, thanks a lot. So Madam Chair and members of Growth Committee, we're pleased to be with you today. And as I said, we're going to present the update and key findings from the Housing Needs Assessment, and then talk about the process to getting towards the Affordable Housing Action Plan. Okay, next slide. So at today's session, we're going to talk a bit about project activity to date, the stakeholder consultations, activities to date and activities upcoming, give you an overview of the needs assessment report, our findings and some feedback, talk about next steps, and then open it up to members of the Growth Committee for questions. Okay, next slide. Just to give you a kind of an overview, the study is organized into 2 parts. The initial work was the housing needs assessment, and that involved demand, supply, and affordability analyses, market and economic development factors, looking at those and how they affect housing in the city, roles of different levels of government and housing sector capacity in the private sector, nonprofit sector, and how they can now work towards meeting identified needs, and then a neighborhood mapping exercise that's showing various housing types across the city. Part 2 of the work is the, as Andy said, the exciting part, perhaps it's the Affordable Housing Action Plan. So we're conducting a number of activities to help inform that plan. The housing needs assessment, certainly, and then the stakeholder engagement and public survey that's being put together to invite input from the public. We will develop a responsive policy framework, create a detailed action plan, and define an implementation strategy through which the plan could be rolled out over the short, medium, and long term. Next slide. So we wanted to give you just a quick update on the stakeholder consultations, activities to date, and the next steps. So activities to date, the objective of the stakeholder engagement strategy is focused on gathering additional context and perspectives to inform the housing needs analysis. So part one activities in stakeholder consultation include action team meetings, key informant interviews, cross-sectoral focus groups, Shape Your City project webpage launch, a project mailbox, which will be attached to the Shape Your City webpage, consultation session with staff, and the briefing today. Okay, next slide. Upcoming consultations. The stakeholder engagement strategy in part 2 will focus on validating emerging priority areas and tabling potential strategies for comment. So the activities will include themed focus groups with different sectors around the city. There's 5 in total. These are in progress now. There will be third-party consultations for vulnerable residents via 5 agencies. So the agencies will work with these vulnerable residents to ensure their voices are heard, and these have just been initiated. There'll be a series of additional key informant interviews, 8 to 12, with people who have key information to input. There will be 3 town hall consultation sessions. The community survey, as we mentioned, which will be launched via Shape Your City. We're just in the final stages of designing the questionnaire and getting it up and running. And then a final plan review, town hall style, once we have this drafted to get input and feedback, and that's targeted for July. Okay, next slide. So we're going to go over the findings from the needs assessment. I'm going to turn it over to Ken Foles to take you through it.
Thanks very much, Ed. As we've embarked on this process, we've encountered a couple of different informational challenges. Our goal here this morning is to give you, or rather early this afternoon, is to give you this high-level overview of what we've been finding to date. Given the level of detail, it's not possible for us to go into a lot of details today, but we'll be able to give you at least an overview of the larger synopsis of what's coming out of the needs assessment. In terms of that, the needs assessment has been completed in 3 specific areas. We've looked at housing demand, housing supply, and housing affordability. And within those various areas, we've used both census data, CMHC data, augmented that with additional data sources, and to provide some context to those numbers, we've highlighted for you some of the stakeholder engagements to help give some additional details. With that, we'll walk you through each of these 3 sort of buckets and provide some highlights, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk about what the final results are at this point. So in terms of housing demand, one of the things that I think most would be aware of is that until recently, population in the city has been declining. We were pleased to see in the most recent Census 2021 results that were just released that trend has reversed, and there's a slight increase in population that has occurred since that time. We do note that growth is largely driven by both international and interprovincial immigration. There's actually an outflow of younger households, but that's being tempered with this inflow from international and interprovincial immigration. And those tend to be more family-oriented in nature. The other thing that we noted in terms of population trends is that the seniors situation, there's a general aging of the population, and like most other jurisdictions in North America, you're seeing a tendency towards the population aging, and therefore the share of seniors in the local landscape growing, and that trend is projected to continue. We also note that when we compared these results to the population projections that the city had developed in 2018, you're actually just slightly below the trend in terms of that growth. So you're not quite on target, but fairly close to what that target was. When we look at household trends, we note that in the city of St. John, households are increasing faster than the population. And this indicates that households are diversifying in terms of their types. So you get household formation, changes in household status through things like divorce or separation, and the formation of smaller households as people move out. So it's not surprising then that you would actually see some of that diversification. The interesting part, though, is that when households are growing faster than population, the household trends actually are an indicator of housing needs. So those link more to dwelling requirements in the future and projecting that as opposed to the past. We also note that, like most jurisdictions, your household sizes are decreasing on average, and that there's an emerging prominence of one-person households. So while they're still a minority number, they are growing in terms of composition. As a general observation, we note that the 10-year split is about 55% ownership, 45% rental, and this isn't uncommon with some of your regional compatriots. We noticed, however, that in the last little while, the renter households as a proportion have tended to grow faster than the ownership component. And that, as you'll see as we move into some of the other trends, is creating some additional pressure in the rental market for those particular units. From an income point of view, we noticed that overall, the average household incomes in the city have actually grown faster than the consumer price index for the province over the last 10 years, and faster than some of your regional compatriots. But the fact remains that your average incomes remain below those of your neighborhoods, even though you're making up some of that ground. Not surprisingly, the incomes for owners are substantially larger. So in 2016, your average owner household income was about $86,000, and for renters it was about $40,000. So it's more than half in terms of that average, which is notable. Obviously, those households who are smaller tend also to have lower incomes, generally because they have less earning power. While unemployment is not uncommon in the region, and the fact that the rates locally are a bit higher than some of the counterparts, it has not risen as fast. Some of your neighbors in Fredericton and Moncton have actually experienced larger increases in those figures over time. We've also noted that a lot of the workforce is localized, so about 80% of the workforce are local residents. One of the things that was noteworthy about this, though, is, and I think it's indicative of what we showed as the difference in average incomes for renters and owners, is that there's a very strong polarization between those groups, and that polarization is continuing to increase. So the gap between renters and owners from an income point of view is growing. When we start to look at the supply side of the equation, we note that there's a very high propensity towards single detached homes, which make up about 41% of the stock, and low-rise apartments, which make up about 40% of the stock. There's very limited mid-density options. Semis and rows, for instance, make up less than 10% of the current stock. For rental stock, from a condition point of view, we note that the rental stock in the city is in slightly worse condition than ownership stock, and there's an indicator in the census data set that talks about the proportion of the stock that needs major repairs. In this instance, about 9.6 for renter units as compared to owner units at 8.6. Not surprisingly, because St. John has an older stock, you have a little bit more of a housing condition issue than some of your regional neighbors, again, in the case of Moncton and Fredericton. Interestingly, we note that a number of demolitions have happened in the last few years, and this is that tendency where we would see recycling of the stock for some of that older stock we just noted. The interesting trend that we noted is that while you've lost a number of units, those units have been replenished through intensification, and there's been a net gain of some 800 units just in the last 3 or 4 years alone, and that they've tended towards multi-unit development as opposed to single detached or low-density forms. We know that the production trends are also showing that we've had a tendency to have some higher density building happening since 2010. But in net effect, when you add production to what's on the ground, the proportions of the different stock types have not changed considerably, despite some of those changes. We also note that when we talk about starts and completions, starts have outpaced completions over this last little while, which tends to signal a growth trend, which is good news. In terms of non-market supply, so here we're talking about those forms of housing that are assisted in some way, shape, or form. And we know that there's sizable wait lists in the local market. Right now, there's about 1,200 or so households on that waiting list, most of which are non-senior singles. There's also family and senior requirements. In terms of supply, while the numbers have been challenging to identify, we note that there's probably in the order of about 1,500 units, at least locally, that serve this from a nonprofit or affordable perspective. We also know that there's a number of emergency shelters, transitional and supportive care, and seniors care facilities that help address those needs of individuals who have not only an accommodation requirement, but also require supports and services to maintain their accommodation. Within the market, we note that some of the dynamics, and I think these are quite familiar to people based on what they've been seeing. The primary market, that is the market which we can identify as purpose-built, and typically we do that through the CMHC survey process. There's about 9,200 units in that particular market. Majority of them are two-bedroom in nature, and that the rents are showing market increases over the last little while. So in the last 10 years, they've averaged about 30% for that period, just under 30%. But in the last year alone, there's been a market increase of 7%. So that's certainly a bit of an anomaly compared to the last 10 years. But there has been a continued increasing of those rents, which have outpaced inflation in terms of the consumer price index. As a result, your vacancy rates are falling, and where we might have seen some fairly substantive rates in excess of 8% over the last few years, those numbers have steadily decreased as a result of supply in the marketplace and are now edging just under 3%. In a balanced market, it's deemed that 3% would be about the indicator level, so you're just below balanced based on, in the primary market anyway, in terms of that benchmark. The other thing that's notable is that there's a fairly healthy secondary rental market that helps augment that supply. And when we look at what's surveyed in the marketplace in terms of primary, covered through that CMHC survey, we also know from StatsCan, when they poll for houses that are rental, it's a significantly larger number. And the difference between those two when you cross-tab for tenure, starts to show that for those facilities where people rent out, say, single detached homes or semis and things of that nature, which are not purpose-built, we know that that sector of the market is about another 3,000 to 5,000 units locally. The difference here is that they don't have the same tenure security and are subject to conversion and tend to have higher rents at the same time. The interesting thing we did note in the primary market was also that there's a real range of rents. So as you can imagine in CMHC's market survey, there are a number of units that are covered by that survey. Older units tend to have slightly lower rents, and the newer, larger buildings are tending to have slightly higher rents, and those are the ones that tend to be more available or coming online. So the reality is that those average rents are trending up towards the high end of that range because that's what's coming online recently. When we look at the ownership prices, again, that's an area where I think everyone's quite aware of what's been happening and have a bit of sticker shock because of the price increases that have been seen in the market. In the last 2 or 3 years alone, for new units, house prices have increased over 30%, and for resales, they've increased almost 40%. That same trend is actually being seen again with your regional neighbors in Moncton and Fredericton. And in point of fact, the increases have been just slightly lower in St. John by comparison. The lower inventory rates and the decline in active listings are indicators that this is pretty much a supply-driven problem. And we know that while we've enjoyed historically low interest rates over the last number of years, that trend is starting to curve up, and that upward interest rate pressure is likely to have an additional impact on that affordability. So let's look at affordability for a second. This is the third of the 3 buckets in our analysis that we talked about. There's 2 measures that we tend to use to try and triangulate what the situations are in any given community. Core housing need is one of those ones. It's a measure that looks at adequacy, suitability, and affordability. And we know that about 12% of the households in St. John in 2016 fell into that core need capacity. And of those, it was about 21% of renters and only about 3.7% of owners. That's fairly consistent regionally with with Moncton and Fredericton as well. One of the measures that's a more common indicator that you will have seen in other jurisdictions is the shelter to income ratio. And under this measure of affordability, if you spend 30% or more of your gross income towards accommodation, you're deemed to have an affordability problem. When we look at those figures for 2016, which are the most recent that are available, about 24% of the households in the city fell into that category. That was up just slightly from 2006. About 14% of owners fall into that category, and just over 1/3 or 36% of renters fall into that category. Again, that's fairly consistent regionally with Moncton and Fredericton. When we look at the ownership affordability, do analysis, and we project forward incomes and look at the different income deciles. So if we take all of the household incomes in the city and split those into 10 even piles, we arrive at deciles. When we start to look at the distribution of incomes in that regard, only those who are in the top 3 income deciles would be able to afford new ownership homes, which are averaging just under $350,000 at this point in time. A household would need an income of over $100,000 to be able to afford that, based on that 30% rule we just talked about. When we look at resale homes, we know that it's a little bit better. About half of the incomes or half of the households would be able to afford that. Those average prices are in the order of about $220,000 right now, and those would require an income of about $55,000 in order to afford based on that 30% rule. So what we're really noticing here from the ownership perspective is that those in the top 40% of the market tend to be able to manage on their own. And because they tend to have more than one income in their family and they have higher incomes, that's a direct product of why they can, why they have that latitude in terms of affordability. From the renter perspective, you may recall that incomes are significantly lower. And for that reason, we note that there's considerably more difficulties in terms of affordability here. So if we look at renter incomes, only those in the top income deciles would be able to afford those average rents that exist out in the marketplace. So typically those with incomes, renters who have incomes over $35,000 a year, household income, they would be able to afford a rent in the order of $885, but we know in the marketplace anything from a 1 to a 3-bedroom unit now is renting on average in that $800 to $1,300 range. So there's going to be some challenges there. Again, we note that there are price distinctions in those ranges, which we mentioned earlier. Larger and newer units tend to cost more in terms of what they're getting in the marketplace. So they're going to be at the high end of those ranges. For those renters who have incomes under $25K, they have really serious challenges accessing the market. Basically, they can't afford to pay those rents. And that accounts for about 1/3 of the renters that we see out there. So they could afford a rent of about $630 at the top end. But even for bachelors, which are just scraping in on average at about $570 a month, up until 2 bedrooms, which are just over $1,100, there's going to be considerable difficulty in their ability to find a place in the market. Now, in terms of a summary of findings, what this is indicating to us is that there's been a recent upswing in growth, and we know that that growth is largely fueled by interprovincial immigration and external immigration. Those are slightly under forecast. We know that your seniors population is growing and that households are getting smaller and are tending towards non-family household in nature or single households. So interestingly, when those two situations, the immigration, both interprovincially and internationally, tends to be more family-based and requires larger units, where the increase in seniors population and non-family households would tend to signal a need for smaller accommodations. Overall, the income is tracking upward, but we note that those lower income groups are losing ground in the context of how that's moving forward. We know that the ownership demand continues to remain, but the renter households, because of the prices in the ownership market, there's increased pressure on the rental market and a very active secondary market, which is picking up the slack. The housing stock is dominated by both those single detached and low-rise forms. There's very little in that mid-density range. So semi-detached rows, condominiums, things of that nature. Because you have an above-average share of older stock in the city, that creates certain issues as well in terms of building condition, but we're certainly seeing issues of or tendencies towards that stock cycling through renewal and replacement. We know that there's a number of rental and ownership options, but the supply conditions are really starting to push costs because of the sustained demand and what's happening in the marketplace. So this has tended to create situations where it has a significant impact on those requiring non-market housing, so those with low income and special needs requirements, in particular because there are no traditional options in the marketplace for them other than some form of assisted housing. From those in the owner market, we know that mid-income households in that area are having challenges in terms of their ability to access the market, especially as prices have increased dramatically in the last few years. And the same holds true for those in the traditional rental market and some of the challenges that they're facing. So what this suggests to us is there are about 4 key gaps in the market that as we move forward and start considering the policy pieces that are going to be most important. I'll start with just second from the bottom here, and you may have seen this diagram before. It's something that CMHC generated as part of their national housing strategy, but it's a diagram that's emblematic of the housing system. It's been around for a long time, and basically call this a housing continuum where you have housing options on the left side of the grid here that speak really to those entering into just getting basic emergency shelter or a roof over their heads, all the way up to those on the far right who are able to access market housing and have the economic means and physical abilities to do that. And in between, there's a gradation of a number of different opportunities and options. It's important to note that people don't stay in any one place here over their life cycle. They tend to move up and down depending on their needs or their situation. And it's very much driven by their income and their economic means. So we'll focus here first on the right-hand side a bit. For those who are most vulnerable, these individuals would be having incomes below that 30th income percentile, typically with household incomes of less than $35,000. Their options in the marketplace are really to access assisted nonprofit or rent supplement housing, things of that nature, to try and accommodate their needs or make out the best they can in the marketplace. Just numerically, we know that the people that fall below that threshold are about 4,000 households. That said, we know that there's a number of individuals who are already residing in assisted housing of some form or addressing some other solutions. So when we think about what would best serve this gap in the marketplace, it's really trying to target rental options that are below that $650 a month requirement. That's what would suit the income that they can afford. Obviously, at those levels, there's nothing offered in the marketplace, so some form of assistance is required to make that work. And for these folks, affordability really is the biggest issue, although there are some access concerns as well. When we talk about affordable rental housing, which is a little bit farther up the spectrum, we're looking at those in the 30th to 60th income percentile. And this accounts for about 1/3 or just less than 1/3 of those in the rental market. So when we're talking about these folks, we're in that household income range about $35K to $45K. Again, we know that numerically that gap covers about 4,000 households, but that again, some of those folks are able to meet their requirements in the marketplace. They do have challenges though, because typically if you translated those incomes, they would be able to afford rents in the $650 to $1,150 range. And we know that again, some of the newer rental stock is, depending on the household size and the type of unit they need, it's going to require some other things. For these folks, affordability and access issues are key. And when we think about both the vulnerable in this rental group, we know that based on that shelter to income ratio, there's about 4,800 households in the income that are in that affordability range. So they're a constituency that's going to require assistance. Those in the vulnerable households more so from the public sector and through creative means, the affordable rental market, through maybe some collective partnerships and opportunities, which we'll flag shortly. The third bucket here is the affordable ownership housing. And again, with the bid up in the market in terms of prices, we're really talking about people above the 60th income percentile here, which again, in traditional markets, the market would normally address those needs, but with the prices bidding up the way they are, it's creating some challenges for those around that 60th. And just again, in terms of situating, we're talking here about folks who might be in that $70,000 a year household option. At the lower end of this range is what we'll be talking about. So housing options that might equate to about $200,000 to $250,000 in today's figures. And the biggest issue here is supply and affordability. Again, if we think about those shelter to income ratios we mentioned earlier, there's about 2,400 households in terms of owners out there that are paying more than 30% of their income. So we're not talking about addressing all of that part of the market. It's the lowest end of that market where we see some interventions might be helpful. The last area is the support of special housing needs, which is on the immediate left side of the spectrum. And this is a special constituency, not only because they tend to have lower incomes, but they also have support and specialized housing needs. Again, this falls into that group that typically will have household incomes below 35K. They have not only access options in terms of rental that can address that. So again, we're talking $650 a month in terms of the rents they might be able to afford or below. But they also have care and support requirements on top of that. And typically there's waiting lists for folks trying to access this. Otherwise, their biggest issue in terms of the marketplace is the supply and access of that specialized housing, but also the affordability piece because they're invariably linked. So hopefully that gives you a quick overview of some of the key findings and areas. One of the things that both Andy and Ed mentioned is that we've been engaged in some stakeholder discussions to date. And as part of those discussions, in addition to validating some of the findings that we've heard, we've also asked for some ideas and some thoughts from individuals about what they see as potential solutions. We just want to give you a snippet of some of that today. A fairly common communique from folks is having incentive programs, targeted programs, that would help with both retrofitting the older stock, knowing the condition that's out there. An idea was floated about purchasing abandoned buildings, and then trying to procure affordable units through private developments. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for trying to expand the supply and address the supply issues through some of these means. There's also a recognition that there's a need to build additional capacity in the system to help deliver affordable housing. And we've been hearing about the challenges both in the nonprofit sector, which tends to have more significant capacity issues than the private sector. But those challenges exist in terms of getting more housing online to address the needs that are seen. A lot of interest from folks in developing more mixed income communities, because we know that there has tended to be a concentration in terms of where some of the income issues in the communities are and some of the housing solutions that have been fostered to date. A lot of encouragement for rent control legislation. Some of this was actually signaled before the recent announcement about capping. But folks are definitely interested given what's been happening in the marketplace and the recent acceleration in rents. Supporting inclusive growth through new taxes. Addressing tax arrears with existing landlords are a couple of the other ideas from a taxation point of view. A lot of discussions about, creating a better environment in terms of the development side of things. So can we identify and remove those barriers that relate to planning policies or processes that help support the growth going forward? Another area that folks looked in on was the notion of getting the infrastructure in place to facilitate housing development. In the development process, there's a lot of things to align and get ready in terms of doing that, and there was thought that creating the environment to do this is much more helpful. Pilot projects are another specific area that folks talked about in terms of showcasing solutions, so demonstrating how it can work and then trying to get others to replicate those successes. And in other areas, because of the different levels of government, the programs they offer, trying to align those solutions and getting a little bit better coordination was a clear emphasis from some. So that gives you just a snippet of some of the initial thinking. Obviously, as we go through the focus groups that we're talking about now and some of the remaining consultations, there'll be a lot more ideas and thoughts tabled by stakeholders. So with that, in terms of our next steps, we're going to be concluding those Part 2 stakeholder consultations that Ed had noted. Moving into what is the most exciting part of this, which is really developing the policy framework and strategies for addressing the needs that have been identified, formulating that into a draft affordable plan with recommendations and implementations, and then consulting on that plan with stakeholders and then finalizing the plan and the associated documentation. With that, Ed and I would be happy to field any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you kindly to both of you for your presentation. It was shocking but not surprising. So it's really great to actually have this information in front of us and be able to work with it. And I'm actually just going to kick you off because I didn't really see anything about this. So I'm just wondering about the impact of short-term rentals, so your VRBOs and your Airbnbs and things like that. I'm not sure if you took a look at that in regards to how it impacts our rental stock here in St. John. It's a question that actually has just come up recently. So in our work to date, it has not been highlighted as an issue. But as we work through stakeholders, we've actually put it on our docket to ask them a bit more about the impact of this. Typically, where we would see that having the most impact is in the secondary rental market. So areas, say, those single-family homes that are rented out, etc. Where it's a real concern is if it starts influencing your primary rental stock. So if that's starting to creep into that area, then that would be a big concern. So it's definitely on our radar as we're talking to stakeholders. So much. All right, Councillor Harris, you're up first.
Thank you, Chair Killen. Through you to the presenters, thank you so much for this high-level overview. It was really detailed. I really appreciated that. I've just got a couple of rapid-fire questions because I'm trying to build a bit of a coherent narrative here around some of these findings. So it's probably just a matter of me asking a few questions here in sequence, and you can just tell me if what I heard was right, I guess. But did I hear you say that there's a mobility factor that's occurring where the likelihood of somebody being able to progress along the housing continuum is diminishing, and the likelihood that due to a life event of some sort, of an adverse life event, of them regressing on that continuum is increasing? Did I put that together correctly?
I think it's fair to say that those opportunities are evident in any situation, whether it's progressing or regressing in the current environment. That might be a slightly different scenario. I think what we would say is in the market information that we've looked at, when the market tightens up and there's less chance for people to move around, then the prevalence of that can increase because people don't have any option to move to. So for instance, a perfect example would be when owners can't access new housing, or first-time homeowners can't, they'll stay in the rental market. And then that creates pressures on the rental market for the people who really need rental market because of their affordability.
Right. And
hopefully that gives you a bit of flavor.
Yeah, it does give me a bit of it. I mean, I've gone through some of that in my own personal journey, so I get it. Did I hear you say the senior population is growing in St. John? I know you said that, but did I also hear you mention that the majority of people on our affordable housing wait list are non-senior singles and families?
That's correct.
Okay. Just a couple more quick ones here, Chair Killen, but feel free to cut me off if I'm over time. 70% of St. Johners can't afford to qualify for a house. Is that right, based on your deciles breakdown?
Yeah, so I guess the caution I would mention here is that it presumes that if someone was going out to the marketplace now to try and access it with the income they had, it would be a challenge. Obviously, people are housed where they are, and they might be overpaying for where they are.
Right.
But that 70% would have a difficulty accessing the market now.
Okay. And my last question is, does our needs assessment, or do you, in your process that you've got in front of you, are we going to look at where our housing is needed? I know that there was an article that came out at CBC that the province is losing around 1,000 affordable units per year, and that broke down into, I don't know what it was in St. John. But I'm just wondering about the placement of that along sort of strategic corridors, because if you have to pay a little more for housing, but you don't need a car, that's a pretty substantial improvement. And so I'm just wondering if in that process, we're going to see where this type of housing, this purpose-built housing, should be focused?
Yes. One of the things that we didn't delve into a lot here today is that there's some sub-area trending that we're seeing. And as we're looking forward, we know that there's some concentrations that exist there. And in looking forward on the policy side, again, one of the things that people have already talked to us about is more balanced communities. So looking at the opportunities of where to best situate the housing and the options that exist out there in the community.
Okay. Thanks.
Councillor Harris. Okay. Deputy Mayor McKenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Ken, for the presentation. A lot of it was expected. I can't lie. I mean, you hear about it in the coffee shops, and people talk about it all the time. It's in the media. So there's obviously some interesting aspects of it, though. And I want to ask you about your focus groups that you have. What's the makeup of the focus group, and how many people in that group have lived experience in poverty or low-income work and that sort of thing?
Actually, I really appreciate the question, Councillor. In terms of the themed focus groups that we have, those are organized around 5 key themes, and they tend to have a cross-section of stakeholders who are, for instance, from real estate, vulnerable populations, seniors groups, accessibility groups. So people who are, quote, in the business or touch the business. It was very clear from the outset that the city wanted to go beyond that and get to the very constituencies which you're talking about. To do that, we felt it was important to work through community organizations. So we've actually connected with the 5 community developer entities out in the priority neighborhoods, and they're going to be conducting third-party engagements with the constituents they work with every day and asking them about these housing issues and feeding that back to us. So that process is just getting started, actually.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that's going to take place. One of the other things that I was surprised at, actually, was there's so much talk right now that we can't fill all the jobs that we have. There's just nobody to work, and yet you say there's high unemployment, higher than normal. How does that, I don't understand that.
Well, in terms of, I can go by the data that we've seen, and I think the figure that, if I remember correctly, I'll just check my sheet here, it was in the order of about 9%. Now, I believe, I just want to make sure, one of the challenges we have is the timing of the data and what's reported to us. Let me just see here. Yeah, so that was a 2016 number, which is why that number is a bit higher. Okay. We've seen some of that trending, so a bit tightening up in that market since then, I would imagine.
Okay, so that's 7 years old, or 5 years old, whatever. Anyway, okay. So now you also, this is my last point. You also mentioned that rental stock in St. John, the older stock is in need of major repairs compared to Fredericton and Moncton. But is that because we have an area of town that would have older buildings, but we also have areas of town where we have brand new buildings. So are our older buildings in any worse shape than older buildings other places? Or is it just because
So I think to your question, Councillor, I guess there's a couple of things just from a nuanced point of view. When one of the measures we look at through the census stats is the age, the period in which the housing was constructed. And from that perspective, you tend to have a bit older stock because you've got stuff that was a majority of which was constructed before 1960. So from that perspective, you have a little bit more than some of your regional neighbors. In terms of, it's a self-reported question on the census as to whether you need major or minor repairs. And in that perspective, you're not very different from your regional neighbors. But I think the big point is that you do have older stock, which just tends to need more repair because of its age.
So it's basically just because we're an older city?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Okay, on to you, Mayor Riordan.
So great. Thanks for the presentation. I've been on council for 9 years, and I represented 3 of the priority neighborhoods of the 5 that are in St. John. So I'm well aware of a lot of the information that's that you've presented today. So it's great to have it all amalgamated and confirmed, I guess, by an outside source. So it's nice to have it. With our older buildings that are in worse shape, what we have found and what I have found looking through the kits historically is a lot of times they're owned by the absentee landlord who doesn't even live in the province. That's been an issue for us as well over time. We also have a group, when I looked at your gaps, your need gaps, of what we would call chronically homeless people. And so they won't transition. They will always be chronically homeless. And that I'm finding has become a bit of a subjective term. People are using chronically homeless, and it's not always in reference, I guess, to what St. John here would call a person who is chronically homeless. It's someone who really you could probably put in the Taj Mahal with an unlimited visa, but still can't function because they need the supportive system, the supports around them. So that's a big gap for us as well. The housing crisis, of course, has been exacerbated with the fact that housing has become, unfortunately, a commodity. And we have people that are making millions of dollars off of renters. So that's such a difficult situation. And we're seeing the buildings in St. John, especially ones that have a lower rate of rent, just being snapped up by these REIT companies that are then, passing on their profits to through their shareholders. So I don't really know how you attack something like that. It's difficult for us, but anyways, that's just a couple of observations that I've had going forward. But like I said, I do appreciate the presentation today. Thank you.
Councillor Harris.
Yeah, just kind of, Chair Killen, do we have any sense of runaway gentrification, or are we filtering our gentrification properly here? I just don't know if this needs assessment touches on that, but you hear the different anecdotes people will give about gentrification. So I'm wondering if this is something, I guess it does lead back to the geographic question that you have seen in your work so far.
So again, I think that's an excellent point. I think based on some of the comments that have been made thus far, and I would go back to the demolition stats that we were providing, where you've got a clear trend of existing stock being demolished and replaced with net increase in units, and tended to be more multi-units than singles. So while you're demolishing singles and multi-res, you're getting more units back And that typically will signal that there's that infilling gentrifying process that's happening. And yes, there is geographic concentrations to that based on where the stock is located. And I think to the mayor's last question about what becomes a target in this market of buying up by REITs, et cetera, and their conversion and repositioning in the market, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I guess from a perspective of like this committee and for council, it's going to be a matter of knowing a couple of things. One, where's gentrifying occurring at an intense rate that's pushing people away from the areas and services that they need, so that we can make up some of that lost ground on income disparity. But then the other question we need to figure out is, where do we have opportunities for intensification on some of these? I love the recommendation that was there from one of your stakeholders on, the city taking an ownership stake in our shelter assets, whether it's incentivizing renovations of existing abandoned buildings or whatever. But yeah, that'll be the other piece that we need to figure out from our place as policymakers, to know how to put a right policy in place to either prevent some of that focused gentrification or to continue the intensification in that area. So anyway, I'm just speaking out loud, but that's, I guess, what I'm trying to put together from all this. So appreciate it.
I appreciate that, Councillor, and I think I'd like to ask Ed for a comment in a second here, but I think one of the things that we know in terms of urban dynamics is that there's gentrification it happens. It's one of those things that we know is there. I think when it happens in a more pronounced way because it amplifies inequity or inconsistencies that exist today, then it becomes a lot more visible, which I think is the situation here. Ed, you might have some additional thoughts on that whole gentrification angle.
Right. Well, I do think what we are seeing in St. John is probably an increase in gentrification activity with the especially interprovincial movement, which is not unusual to St. John. It's happening in a lot of communities where people are coming from the larger centers with some dollars in their pocket and consuming some of that housing and gentrifying it to the detriment of some of the existing people with lesser incomes. So I think it is something we want to look at, and how are there measures that we could take here to slow that down or not have such an impact.
Thank you both so much. I have one more question after that really great discussion from everyone. So just to flip it a little bit, how stable are we? Because one thing I've noticed is that, in 2019, we weren't necessarily having these problems. Not because of the lack of effort on the city to grow and to attract more tax base, but now we have these really, inflated numbers, right? And are we looking at a 2008 housing crisis coming down the pipeline at some point? Will there be a bust?
Again, I think Ed might have some thoughts on that. I think one of the things we've tried to flag in the needs assessment piece is certainly we've seen a turn in the market in terms of interest rates and the impact that that's going to have. And it's not going to happen overnight, but it will be another pressure. I think everyone's a bit curious about supply chain and what's going to happen globally in the next little while, whether, things start to stabilize a bit more, because I think there's some supply pressure issues related to pricing. And there'll be a saturation. There's a certain point where the market saturates in terms of trying to do that. So I think the other thing I just wanted to highlight, one of the challenges we're facing right now, and we're very happy to see the 2021 population data come out. We're still waiting for more of that census data to roll out later this year to give us a clearer picture of what's happened in the last 5 years, because it's clear that that's different than the 5 years before. But I think the crystal ball is a little bit challenging in terms of what's going to happen, and Ed probably has some more observations on that.
Right. Maybe being a little older than Ken, not much. I will say that my observation over time is the housing market changes, and what we're seeing today with this hyperinflation in house prices, again, not just in St. John, but across the country, is not sustainable. You cannot sustain a market that's 25, 30% annual increase. So I suspect it will right itself over time. And then cities like St. John that take special initiatives to deal with the specific problems we're uncovering will be that much farther ahead. I was just watching on the news myself yesterday, the concerns about the supply chains, labor availability to be able to meet demands. And I think you'll see efforts from the sector to increase those resources and meet that demand. You're seeing the recent federal budget trying to adopt some measures. So I do think it'll right itself, but it will be kind of a new ground for housing markets where you've had the hyperinflation and house prices. They will level off, but it is stifling the housing continuum at this time. But I wouldn't be always pessimistic. These things do turn around.
Well, that's very comforting. Thank you. I know it's a big one for sure. And on behalf of all of us at the Growth Committee, I really appreciate you bringing all this information to us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So on that note, I will take a motion to receive and file. Councillor McKenzie, Mayor Riordan, and on the question, everybody good? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Okay. So on to the next item here, item 1.4, we have the engagement strategy for the strategic market, strategy for the city market strategic plan. And we are going to hear a presentation from Greg Cutler.
Thank you very much, Chair Killen, and good afternoon to the rest of the Growth Committee. I am here to present a bit of an update on the City Market Strategic Plan, the process that we've gone through so far briefly, and then more specifically about the engagement that we are currently undertaking. We're actually starting this week. So we divided our project into 4 distinct stages. The kickoff stage, more of an information gathering, and then moving into engagement, planning, and reporting. We have completed the information gathering portion. And for a brief update on some of the key takeaways and things completed, just like to highlight that we started out by selecting a consulting team. We have FBM and Key North that are working with us through this process. We've created a staff oversight team, selected our 10-person city market strategic plan, or steering committee, sorry. That committee has met 3 times to this point, 3 good meetings. We actually have our 4th meeting coming up in May the 4th. That is our first in-person meeting. Our consultants had a site visit in mid-February, spent 2 days in the city. We're able to have a lot of vendor input, vendor interviews, met with city staff for extensive meetings as well, did some of their own observations regarding the market operations and things like that. So that was really fruitful time. Staff also collected what I'd say was a catalog of documents, and we're able to put those into a package and send them off to our consultants for background, so that way they had a foundation to lay their project on top of. And we've also begun discussing vision, mission, core values, and then I'd like to say that everything we do also has the inclusion and equity lens as well. So just a brief update to say that we had some goals for stage 1, and we were quite happy with how that's gone. And we are actually starting this week with phase 2, which is our engagement. If we had a wayfinding map, this would be sort of where we see the red star saying, you are here. We did start this week. We are going to use multiple tools to solicit input and feedback from the community and from visitors. I'm going to highlight 4 of our strategies that we are currently planning at this point in time, and go over some key dates and timelines for those. The first being our Shape Your City page. We all know that Shape Your City is an online engagement platform. We're looking to allow residents to interact, provide some ideas, feedback, engagement. We are working on that as we speak. We think it's going to be convenient and interactive. Our page will have 3 different aspects to it. There'll be a survey, and then a quick poll, and an ideas board as well. So currently we have it completed in test mode. The English is completed, and the text has been sent off to translation. So all that to say that once we get translation back, I will be able to switch it from a test mode and kind of go live. So we're looking to do that hopefully by the end of this week. Our goal was this week, so we are on track, provided that we get our translation back in time. And when it does go live, it'll be open for engagement until approximately May the 10th. We want to have a time where give people enough time to interact with us, but not too much time where it's up and it starts to go stale. So that's our plan with that one. I should also mention that with Shape Your City, myself and one of our consultants are sort of identified as the who's watching piece. So we'll be able to interact if people have questions throughout. So basically for the entire time the survey is open, we'll be able to engage with residents or visitors or whoever wants to click on the who's listening and have a chat with us. We also, our second piece, we have a pop-up community engagement session. We see this as a casual way of hearing from people who are currently using the market. We also hope it's a way that we can engage some folks that may not have time or the interest in engaging in other ways, but we're looking at people who are already in the market. It'll happen on Thursday, May the 5th from 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. So we'll set up a booth in the middle of the market, engage with folks as they come through, really hoping to hit a lot of students and a lot of our uptown business folks who are in for lunch, a way to solicit ideas, feedback, conversations, disseminate some information to them. We'll be doing that in partnership with our consultants. They'll be in town for their second site visit. And we also plan as city staff, when the consultants aren't here, is to have some more of these pop-up style engagement sessions, specifically for tourism sector and tourists. As we know, this summer, hopefully, things will be very busy, visitor related. And we do want to get their feedback too. Obviously, it's very important. And some of the things like the Shape Your City, there is a sign-on or an aspect where it's more geared towards some of our residents. So we think that some engagement, pop-up style, where visitors and tourists are going to be, will be very beneficial for us. So we plan to do that later in the summer when the season kicks off. Similar to the housing strategy, we've identified over 50 stakeholders. So our third piece is a stakeholder engagement, and we have some specific sessions for our stakeholders as well. For our clarity, the team has sort of subdivided our long list of stakeholders into community groups, neighbors, business, residents, arts and culture, and newcomers. So we've got a large list of folks that we think will play an important role in this. while they are encouraged to take part in our other engagement opportunities, whether it's Shape Your City or the pop-up, we do want to have a specific time sessions with our stakeholders, and we are doing that. There's going to be 90-minute sessions. We have 3 planned at this point, in-person sessions, May the 4th and May the 5th. So that'll give us a time between city staff and consultants. They'll be in town. So we're going to have sessions with our stakeholders. Where we see these being very important folks in the process, we are going to, after these sessions, we'll follow up with them as we go through the summer where needed. And then also there'll be some more organized regrouping again in the fall, early September, to go over some of the stakeholder information again. And last but not least, we also know there's many standing boards and committees in the city who are obviously there because they have some background knowledge and some information in certain sectors. So we feel it's important to interact with these standing boards and committees. We actually started meeting with boards and committees this week. So as an example, we met with the Crew St. John Business and Community Liaison Committee. Again, it's a way that we can connect with tourism sector and some of our, get a leg in on some of the tourism stakeholders as well. So that was on Monday. It went really, really well. We also meet with the St. John Ability Advisory Committee later in April. And we are currently engaging with the Heritage Board, Heritage Development Board, and then the Community Arts Board as well. We see them as being key boards and committees to work with. And again, we will meet with them April, May timeframe based on their meeting schedules. Will be added to their agenda for the next meetings, and then follow up as required through the summer, and then more organized follow up again in the fall before we move into the reporting stage. I'd like to say that communications, we want to make sure people know about these opportunities. So communications department has been vital so far in getting us to this point. Again, we're just starting our engagement, and communications will play a key role in making sure that everyone is well aware of all the different opportunities that are out there for engagement on this process. So with that, it's a pretty brief look at our engagement process, but we're very excited to get this started and sort of meet with people. We understand that the market is a facility and a venue that draws a lot of attention. So we're looking forward to actually soliciting that feedback in a more organized and professional way as opposed to just conversational. So that's where we are now. So with that, I'll actually turn it back over to Chair Killen if there's any questions or comments regarding the engagement piece.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler. It's really appreciated. I just have a bit of an administrative note just before we continue. We are going to need a motion to extend the meeting to 2:30. We have 3 more items, and I just want to get a motion to approve extending the meeting. Councilor Harris, Mayor Riordan. Okay. And on the question, is everyone okay with that? Okay. So we're good there. That being said, so we have 45 minutes to try and get all of this settled up. So if we could keep our questions fairly brief for Mr. Cutler, and also on the next couple of items so we can get to everything. So, okay, with that being said, who has a question? Is everyone okay? All right, then I will take a motion to receive and file this report. Deputy Mayor, any seconders? Oh, sorry, Mayor Riordan. On the question, are we all set? Okay, thank you very much. Motion carried. Thank you so much, Mr. Cutler. All right. So on to the next item here. We have Mr. David Doppelstein, who's going to present to us on the Encore funding for the Sidewalk Cafe Rebate Initiative.
Good afternoon, members of Growth Committee. I'm pleased today to be before you to talk about the Municipal Encore program, which is a program that you would have received an orientation on in your kit, but this is the first chance this Growth Committee has had an opportunity to discuss the program. So I'll give you a very brief crash course in where the program comes from, and then talk about this specific initiative today. So Council approved on the recommendation of Growth Committee, the Economic and Community Recovery Program back in May of 2020. This was just shortly after, as you would all recall, the pandemic started, and there was massive closures of business all across North America, including in St. John. And what Council decided at the time was to reserve 80% of the funds remaining in Growth Reserve to support economic and community recovery through the pandemic. So this was a way for us to support our businesses and our community to get us through this tremendous hurdle as a community. There's a few hallmarks, and I won't go through all these in detail because they are in your report, but the general parameters of the program were laid out by Council and Growth Committee's recommendation, and it was primarily about inducing support. So rather than, it wasn't about providing direct support, which was what senior levels of government were doing. They were providing direct support, particularly to businesses. This was the way for the city, in a sense, to try to get customers on businesses' doorsteps, and then the business's job was to get them inside their doors. So rather than us give money directly, we were supporting programs to get customers to the door or to support the community getting outside safely. So as an example, some of these programs that we've enacted as a municipality over the last 2 years are Open Streets program. We had a tourism rebate program where we partnered with the Hotel Association and Envision St. John to try to encourage people to spend a weekend here in St. John. We had a free parking program, which we offered with Uptown St. John, where we offered free parking for about a month and a half to try to encourage people to come shop in our core. We had a spotlight program, which was to partner artists with local businesses, and again, to stimulate creativity and encourage people to get out and experience that. And then a program that we offered last year, which we're recommending we offer again this year, is the initiative before you today, and that's the Sidewalk Cafe Initiative, or the Sidewalk Cafe Rebate Initiative. I won't talk too long about the Sidewalk Cafe program because you would have heard about this, particularly at council meeting recently as we updated some parameters. But essentially what this program is, this is about rebating 100% of the fees that Sidewalk Cafe applicants would pay to the city, both their fee for the patio, their fee for their zoning confirmation letter, and then the fee for the parking space that they would need to use, especially if they were using a space in the public right-of-way to actually build a structure. Prior to this year, we had 17 businesses last year participated, which was quite an increase. You don't have the amount previously, but it was a lot of businesses last year told us that because it was free, it gave them the capacity to make a capital improvement, to make that long-term investment in building a patio. And we're hopeful that we'll see that again this year. So we're recommending that we allocate again $20,000 through the Encore Fund for this initiative. We already have the process in place through our one-stop development shop to rebate it instantly for any applicant, and the process is fairly smooth and fairly straightforward. And again, this would be for applicants specifically for the Sidewalk Cafe program. So it's not just anyone with a patio, it's for that specific initiative. And again, the parameters are laid out here in your kit, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Okay, we're going to kick off with Mayor Riordan.
Thank you. I have a question about just the physical Sidewalk Cafe. What is that?
So I could maybe turn to Director Poffermoth to talk about that if I missed the definition here. But a Sidewalk Cafe, there's 3 different tiers. And it's a specific zone in our uptown core where we permit businesses to have space in the public right-of-way where they can put patio chairs or basically a deck. So, and there's 3 different tiers that range from just a simple bistro set all the way up to basically a full-scale deck that would be barricaded against vehicles where you could have an outdoor patio, essentially. Is that, yeah.
So a bistro set is now considered a cafe. That wasn't historically, though, was it?
It was, yeah. Historically, even last year it was.
So last year, but was the year before, was it? So those little tables and chairs have always had to have a permit, like on Germain Street, just those little colorful ones. My concern, and I mentioned it at council the other night, is losing the animation of our streets. I mean, I know we're going to reimburse people this year. I'm all for this program. But how do we ensure that your streets are still animated as you go forward with a bench? I don't know. Those little bistro tables, nobody serves anything at them. They just kind of look cute and welcoming out there.
through you chair to Mayor Riordan, yeah, it's always been a requirement. And I mean, people, to get approval for that is quite simple. So animation of the street and some colorful bistro sets or benches or whatever is something that's absolutely doable if people come in. But they are occupying our property, and we need to make sure that certain things are covered, including insurance requirements.
Okay. I just see parked vehicles on the sidewalk too, which drive me crazy. But the other thing is that I guess, and this is a bigger discussion, and like I said, 100% for this, or another day, is do we want parking or do we want cafes? So if we end up currently with, if I want to take up the parking space, it would cost me to pay, I would pay for that space. But this is a discussion for the future. You know, if we think parking's what we want in the uptown, then we'll leave it like that. And if we think, you know, having a patio out there, maybe that isn't a requirement in the future, you know, to try to get some of those spaces used for other uses versus parking, if that's what we want, is parking. Anyways, I just throw that out there today, being a bit of a devil's advocate here today.
Thank you, Mayor.
Since I'm not in the chair over there.
Oh, no. That's make a good point. So over to Councillor Harris.
I just want to pick up on that before I forget. We absolutely want cafes. We want pedestrianized streets. The return on investment there is way higher than having a parking space. So that's my opinion. But to this point, I'm curious, do we have any options here to try, like I'm just thinking about placemaking. What we're trying to do is animate our streets. We're trying to give people a nice, easy pathway so that they don't mind putting a few things here or there. But is there any way that we can look at this, or has staff spent any time looking at this from a way of trying to focus this something like a $20,000 investment, let's say, which is really, if I understand correctly, us foregoing the revenue opportunity associated with that rather than just giving money, which is an important difference. But is there any way we can go, like I'll look at Pub Down Under, right? They've got a really big Cass and Kettle, really big, nice patio, always full, right? People always come in to use it, want to sit outside, want to use that space. But then there's other shops that are smaller scale, and I'll think of something like Bella's, and up in their feel-good store where Ann is. That space tends to be still quite active, but do they have the investment opportunity to build out that area and that offering they have to the public? Are we looking at that from a strategic perspective? It's more of a question of what is staff looking at, and have we looked at prioritizing the money going to places where there already isn't investment? Because I would imagine Cass and Kettle doesn't have a whole lot of capital investment to do anymore in their deck or their patio. But to go from a small bistro set to a bit of a more encompassing infrastructure for a place like Bella's, they need more support. So has staff looked at that, heard anything about that? Am I the first one bringing it up? Just curious.
Through your chair to the councillor, it's a fantastic question. And I would say we have designated the area of Uptown to permit sidewalk cafes wherever businesses essentially want to host them. And so what this program does is it permits businesses to essentially save on initial startup costs for the permitting and the fees that they would normally otherwise have to pay. And this is standard across all of North America. While this program doesn't actually help with the capital costs of helping them afford the patio, it incentivizes them to make that upfront cost, at least for the first year. So absolutely, if you want to mention Bella's, for instance, or other, we saw that last year where a number of new businesses decided to take a gamble, and some started with bistro chairs, some started with a level 2 or level 3 patio, where they built that infrastructure. And that's again where we're hoping with the program. So rather than provide direct support to the business for the cost of wood, we're saying we're going to waive our fees so that you can make this investment, and then hopefully you'll continue it in years to come. So
Okay. I think, maybe that's a different discussion, a different day, is this kind of this idea of placemaking. But I do see the connection. I thank you for that.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm a big supporter of this. I think it's very important to help animate our streets and allow the creative entrepreneurs to put their touch on it. Germaine and Prince William are just so gorgeous with the tree canopy and the patios and everything. So I'm going to read this motion. It is a few sentences, so just bear with me for a second. So the motion is that the Growth Committee recommends to Common Council that Common Council enact and direct the city manager to implement the 2022 Sidewalk Cafe Rebate Initiative. Further be it resolved that the city direct up to $20,000 to rebate applicants who pay for Sidewalk Cafe permit fees, zoning confirmation fees, and fees for parking spaces through this initiative from the Growth Reserve funds already allocated to the Municipal Economic and Community Recovery Program. So can I have a first mover there? Councillor Harris, second by Mayor Riordan. And on the question, all those in favor? Okay, thank you very much, David. On to the next item, we have item 1.6, the Community Enhancement Program, and we're going to hear from presenter Ben Purinton. Oh, sorry, Jack, I did this again. We're going to first get an introduction from Commissioner Jacqueline Hamilton.
Good afternoon, members of the Growth Committee. I'd like to just take a moment while Ben is setting up just to set the context for this item. So many of you know Ben Purinton as the manager of our Dangerous and Vacant Buildings program. He's here actually today to share additional context on a new initiative that we have underway that's identified in the Growth Work Plan for 2022, and it's really aimed at addressing some of the earlier feedback that we'd had from members of the committee and council around really how to support a more holistic approach to some of our property-related compliance programs, and really trying to focus our efforts, both carrots and sticks, to drive growth outcomes and to really get at some of these problem properties earlier on in the process. I would like to just a word of caution to committee that we're at the very early stages in this work. So this is really to explore the suite of initiatives that will help drive this, and we have a lot more due diligence to do. So I know you'll be excited to see some of the ideas that Ben is bringing today, but we really need to do further investigation and evaluation before we're ready to launch, but this will provide a good framework for you to understand where we're headed. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ben.
Thank you, Commissioner Hamilton. Good afternoon to the chair and to the committee. Today I'll be providing an update on the current status of the 2022 Community Enhancement Project. So just to provide an overview of what will be presented, we'll be beginning with an introduction to the project as well as define its scope. We'll be then discussing some new programs being considered for development under the project, as well as other opportunities that have been identified. We'll discuss how this project relates to neighborhood planning, as that'll be a key element of the project moving forward. And then finally finish with a project timeline. So beginning with an introduction, so this project is a one-year holistic evaluation of our programs with a focus on property bylaw compliance. We'll be assessing existing programs as well as developing new ones to better align our bylaw compliance efforts with Council's priorities. We'll also look to collaborate with additional projects ongoing within the department, such as the Development Incentives Project and neighborhood planning, to create synergy in driving desired change in key communities. Additional resources have been provided to Growth and Community Service to conduct this evaluation, which will be ongoing throughout 2022. So just to define some scope for the project, we're looking to develop some new programs as well as rework existing ones that allow us to better execute on Council's priorities, specifically the Grow and Belong priority. We'll also look to have this project align with and progress desired outcomes of existing and potentially future neighborhood plans. And when looking at developing new programs, we'll look to develop those that have the most impact with the resources available and those that can be sustained long-term. So before we move into some of the initial ideas that I wanted to discuss, I wanted to give some context on the current state of the vacant building program. The state of the program has changed significantly over the past number of years, and the ideas being presented relate to the work done in that time. So in past years, efforts were focused primarily on addressing the hazardous buildings in the city through demolition. In 2018, the program hit a record high 220 total cases, with 30 vacant building demolitions seen that year. Today, we currently monitor 145 vacant buildings, and 95% of the cases we monitor do not require demolition. Efforts are focused on working with property owners to pursue voluntary compliance and prevent demolition. This change in approach was caused primarily by the amount of cases that have been resolved, which has significantly reduced the amount of hazardous buildings in the city. Since 2017, over 330 vacant building cases have been resolved, with approximately 100 of those being resolved through demolition. And changing market conditions have also allowed vacant building redevelopment to be more feasible, and buildings that may have progressed towards demolition in the past are today being purchased and redeveloped by private developers. These changes have culminated in a vacant building program that is different today than what was needed 5 years ago, requiring less enforcement action through demolition, but still requiring a concerted effort to resolve the remaining cases, some of which are detriments to their community. So with that context out of the way, I'll move into some of the initial program ideas we have for development under the project. Before we discuss this, however, I do want to clarify that these initial ideas are still being evaluated, and it may be determined that some are not feasible to be implemented. And it is also unlikely that we'll have resources to implement all of these programs within the year. So we'll be narrowing down which will move forward as the project progresses. So the ideas that we'll discuss are the Unsightly building program, a vacant building fee, and the vacant lot developer notification list. So beginning with the Unsightly building program, a vast majority of buildings that we monitor under the vacant building program cannot be pursued through demolition. In a lot of cases, we're able to generate positive results by working with owners to pursue voluntary compliance. However, there are cases that stagnate, and if they're not hazardous, the city has limited options in terms of enforcement. This is problematic because buildings that stagnate can deteriorate and become a hazard, and then the building may need to be demolished through city action, which is an undesirable outcome. Under existing legislation, we're able to pursue enforcement action on unsightly buildings and repair any unsightly conditions at an expense to the property owner. If we were to implement an unsightly building program, we'd look to utilize that currently unused piece of legislation as a tool to drive voluntary compliance and drive positive change on vacant building cases that are stagnating as a result of non-action by the owner. This would allow us to address vacant buildings through enforcement that are not yet a hazard, but are stagnating and as a result detracting from the neighborhood, diminishing community and pride, and deterring investment into the community. The next idea to discuss is the vacant building fee. So as I mentioned previously, non-hazardous vacant buildings can remain vacant for extended timeframes and can detract from the surrounding community. In other areas of Canada, vacant building fees have been established and owners pay an amount that increases each year the building remains vacant. If we were to implement something similar, the fee would cover some of the costs associated with monitoring a vacant building and would also it may also deter owners from allowing their building to remain vacant for an extended time frame. One challenge identified with this, however, was be surrounding collection. Other jurisdictions are able to add these outstanding fees to the outstanding property tax bill. In New Brunswick, we currently do not have the authority to add these fees to the outstanding property tax. There are other penalties associated if the fee were to go unpaid, although not as effective as adding it to the property tax. And then moving on to the vacant lot developer notification list. So as I had mentioned previously, approximately 100 vacant buildings have been demolished in the past 5 years. These demolitions primarily took place in the North End and South Central Peninsula, resulting in a significant amount of vacant lots in these areas. There's significant tax-based growth potential if these lots can be redeveloped. However, there's also significant barriers associated with them, such as outstanding property taxes, water bills, and demolition bills. Under the vacant building program, we currently run the developer notification list, which provides owners the ability to advertise their vacant building for sale to a list of 35 developers. That program was introduced in 2021 and was effective at generating sales for vacant buildings that otherwise would have remained stagnant. With a developer notification list for vacant lots, we'd seek to address these lots by identifying good opportunities and notifying developers of them, similar to what we currently do for vacant buildings. We'd also work to address barriers using tools available to the city, community partners, and the province to progress lots that otherwise would remain unaddressed. Some other opportunities that will be pursued under this project include expansion of our developer notification list, so it is available to all 3 of our compliance programs and not just vacant buildings. We'll also be assisting in the development of incentives in areas outside of the South Central Peninsula that drive meaningful change and are tied to our enforcement programs. We'll be evaluating the minimum property standards program to address areas for potential improvement. And finally, we'll be assessing ways to work with the province on ways to accelerate tax sale on abandoned buildings. Another key element to this project includes providing support to the neighborhood planning team. This will include reworking or leveraging our existing enforcement programs to drive meaningful change in desired neighborhoods, as well as ensuring new programs deliver on desired outcomes of the neighborhood plans by supporting growth, improving quality of life, and fostering civic pride. We'll also work to develop incentives that will act as a catalyst for growth and facilitate the development of complete communities, and then finally assisting in plan development for the North End. And just to finish up with a timeline for the project. So currently we're in the research phase of the project, identifying opportunities and associated barriers. We hope to narrow in on specific programs moving forward over the course of the next month and then begin detailed design. Again, I want to reiterate that as the project progresses, it may be determined that some of the ideas previously mentioned may not be feasible to implement. In the final months of the year, we'll be preparing the program for full implementation in 2023, getting necessary approvals, bylaw amendments, and staff training completed. And a couple additional notes, we'll be returning to Growth Committee for another update on the project, likely at the August meeting. And throughout the year, we'll be providing additional support to the incentive and neighborhood planning team to assist in those projects moving forward. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. We're going to start with Mayor Riordan.
Thank you, Chair. Ben, always love to see you here. You always bring a good kit for us. I love some of these initiatives that are in here. I know unsightly buildings. I know probably Halifax has a stricter, but I know that if you put that stuff in, that you also have to have the resources that will police it. So I get the balance. The vacant building fee, I love that. I know there's a challenge to collect it. I get all that. So I'm so happy to hear that some of these things are being explored. But I think it's pretty exciting for us because, over the 9 years I've been here, as you say, in the last whatever time frame, 100 buildings have been, demolished over time. But they've sat around for years, until that happened, creating difficulties for neighborhoods. For the neighbors that live next door because they're not insured. They could have squatters in them. They could have raccoons in them. So it's always been a problem for us. So it is nice to see this project on the go. So thank you so much.
Okay, now over to Councillor Harris.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. Through you to Ben. This is really near and dear to me. Like, I can't really overstate how grateful I am to see this make its way here. I mean, obviously, in hindsight's 2020, if we could have rolled the clock back to 2011 and had some of this in place, what would the difference be? But I see so much potential in those programs, and I think it'll be the key balancing act will be, do we have enough carrot to offset the stick that we're going to bring? And I see that you guys are already way out in front of that. But again, I'm just very impressed and so grateful. This is where I personally cut my teeth on issues in the city. And I've been in some of these vacant buildings and chased out raccoons, as the mayor has talked about, with volunteers. And so I think around this issue, there's a lot of people paying attention, a lot of people who are excited about new initiatives, especially in this area. And I think, I think the public will be thrilled to see us roll this out. So anyway, thank you for putting it together. And I love that balancing act that you guys are taking because it looks fantastic.
All right, now over to Director Poffenroff. Sorry, Jerry.
Yeah.
That's okay. This is, I'm looking at my screen here. Councillor Lowe.
So you tear a building down and the city tears it down and the property owner doesn't pay for it. The bill for tearing it down goes on the tax bill for the property, correct? Can as a councillor in a geographic area find out what the cost was to tear that building down, added to the property tax? And I guess the question would be, can the councillor find out whether the owner of the land or the city pay? I mean, if the owner of the land tears it down, naturally doesn't get, taxed onto the tax. Can the councillor find out the difference, and can the councillor find out what it costs to get the building tore down on that property?
Through you, the chair, to the councillor, we do have records going back on costs for vacant building demolitions that the city has conducted, going back quite a number of years. So those costs are available, but if they have been added to the outstanding property taxes, one way to determine it could be by adding or ordering a property tax certificate, which displays the total amount of outstanding property taxes on the property. So I guess my recommendation would be to start there, to ordering a property tax certificate and determining the total amount of tax, but we could also provide the.
But I mean, the city refers it out to get somebody, they tender it out to get it torn down, correct?
Correct.
Especially if it's a big one.
Yep.
And then I just want to know, can the counselor in that area find out what the cost was, that's all?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, good. That's all I want to know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Deputy Mayor McKenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Ben, thanks for the update. I got to tell you, I was around when we first started this program of, dilapidated buildings and trying to clean up the city of St. John. And I love the way it's evolved from the early stages, because of those days we had a little bit of money to tear one down and then the province would pay us back. And now we're going we're rolling it out like crazy and keep adding new things to it, like, penalties and fees to help us out. I don't think there's another community in Canada that's doing this at the rate that we are. I mean, we're doing something that I guess we never had the ability to do before, and it's because of people like you that it's working so well. So I just want to thank you for being here and thank you for all you do to clean up the city of St. John and our dilapidated building.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. All right, yeah, very exciting stuff. I know you've made Councillor Harris very happy today, so I'm going to take a motion to receive and file. Councillor Lowe, Mayor Riordan, on the question, all in favor? Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Have a great day. All right, on to our final item of the day, and great job, everyone, for keeping this time going. So it's item 1.7, land for public purposes. And we're going to get an introduction from Phil Ouellette.
Through you, Chair Killen, to the committee. This is a presentation on an update to the Land for Public Purposes policy and the approval of the policy statement. Before I go any further, we did discover a small typo in the report. The levels of funding for each of the three components should be at 5,000 for local level, community level at 10,000, and citywide 50,000. That is consistent with what's in the policy, but for whatever reason we messed up in the report and had it at a different number. So the policy is fine. It's just what was indicated in the report. So I'm just going to read just very quickly that about LPP. A development of vacant land for the purposes of human habitation results in a further demand for land for recreation enjoyment in the neighborhood, community, and the city. The Community Planning Act recognizes this need and requires that land which is part of a subdivision be set aside for public purposes, or that money in lieu of lands is received by the municipality. So St. John chooses to distribute that funding or that revenue it collects for money in lieu of land through the development, through an open grant process with the community. Not every community takes that particular approach. We have a tradition of doing that here in St. John. It works very well for the city. This policy has required some housekeeping amendments for a while, which is why we are here today. As you will see from the short presentation from the Supervisor of Community Services, Emily Murphy, the policy changes are really to expand eligibility, clarify criteria used by staff to evaluate, which should help those who are applying, and to clarify that the city will be doing one call a year for this versus two, which we've done in the past. So with that, I'll pass it off to Emily.
Explained land for public purpose policy, the LPP policy. Essentially, staff see it as empowering community groups to perform projects throughout the city, which support recreation, park space, and wellness. So some examples that we have throughout the city of the fund that the developers would contribute to would be resurfacing pickleball courts, building bike and hiking trails, building war monuments, and Jarvis Bay, and so small, also like a neighborhood rain garden. So staff have recognized in the past that there are some worthwhile projects that maybe haven't come to fruition. So the updates that we've suggested are there basically to better support community groups to get these projects off the ground. And as Phil alluded to, just some of the top sort of things would be that the policy suggested barrier-free. Well, what does that mean? So we've defined those things as meaning that it now does not cost money. We've defined it as it does not cost money for the public to be there, and it does not have a fence around it. So in the past, maybe somebody would have read the policy, read barrier-free, but not exactly understood what that meant. We've increased the allowable funding to essentially be in keeping with the fact that projects are just costing more now. And we've clarified that grants typically would have been on city-owned land. We are now clarifying that they will be considered on provincial, federal, and private land so long as they meet the criteria. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to reduce some interpretation and strengthen the support for our community groups who are doing really great work out there with their land for public purpose projects. So staff's recommending that the Growth Committee adopt the updated LPP policy statement, which is outlined in the report. So over to you, Chair Killen.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to start off with Councillor Harris.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Can you remind me, and maybe I missed it, but how much on any given year do we have in the LPP fund?
Through your chair to Councillor Harris, it depends on the development. So as staff will meet yearly, and we will find out from our finance committee sort of how much is in the purse for that year. It doesn't mean that we have to allot all of that funding. Currently, there's $241,000. And so each sort of round, we would accept applications, and that's what we have to work with. We typically don't spend all of that.
Right. And so the guidelines around moving it from it having to be on our land to it being available for even projects being on private land, but you know, what are what's the barrier, or not barrier, what's the word I'm looking for? What's the threshold that exists now under the new guidelines where this is perceived as a public good or it's perceived as a public project? So, okay, I've got a thing, it's on my private land, and I open it up where a few community groups are allowed to come and use my field, let's say. I have an empty field and they use it for sports practices where they don't need all the infrastructure, but they just want an open field to run around and practice on, and I'm renting it out. Just throwing a haphazard example in here. Where's that threshold of, okay, this is now there's now an opportunity for me to apply for an LPP application on my private land because the community is using it?
Yeah, so essentially that it would be a last resort to be on private land, and it would require going through general council to have some sort of agreement in place. But if you look at examples in the Community Planning Act of access through somebody's property to get to trails or access to water through somebody's property, it does allow for private land to be used for public purpose. So this is just sort of clarifying that. Also, you know, there are a lot of partnerships currently with the city and with the province, you know, sports fields on provincial land, things like that. So we didn't want to eliminate the possibility, for instance, of a dog park within a sports facility that's on provincial land, not happening. And so it just would require that general council look at it on a case-by-case basis to ensure that it's in the best interest of the public.
I guess I have some specific questions, but I see your light on, Phil. And I see Mayor Riordan come behind me, so I'll come back.
It's a good question, and Emily answered it very well. There's just a couple additions that I'd put to that. First, the policy indicates very clearly that for-profit organizations will not be considered. So that's one example. The other thing is we have oftentimes received multiple applications. We chose not to fund anybody. And those are really challenging because we weren't upfront with what we're using as our criteria for determining it. So this policy now is we're putting it on the table. We're being very clear. And a great example is our vision for our recreational programming in St. John through Play SJ. So if we've just built a new dog park, for example, a block away from where a private owner wants to develop a new dog park because they don't like that location, but there would be a poor example of a land for public purposes draw. And we see these types of applications often where they haven't done their due diligence, they do not have the full community input. So there is a lot of discretion on staff to make sure that they uphold these policies and that they review it. And as you recall, any grant that is submitted comes back to council. We provide a recommendation to council for the distribution of those funds. So that's the access point through council to make sure that we've upheld our policy, our end of the bargain to uphold the policy. So just thought that I'd add those two caveats.
Great, thank you. Over to Mayor Riordan.
Thank you. Emily, I was just wondering when I looked through the guidelines for evaluation, I've noticed in some of our policies we talk about inclusion and diversity, and so I'm just wondering about how you would go about looking at the apps when they come in to ensure some of that. And I guess I'm even thinking about equity within the city, around the city. Some groups, maybe are a little bit more savvy at, applying for funding or whatever, whereas other ones may not be. I don't know. So that was just a question that popped into my mind when I went through the book, the actual paperwork that you had.
Can you hear me? Through your chair to Mayor Reed. It's an excellent point and something that we've addressed in the policy, in that there are from time to time projects that community service staff have identified as a need in the neighborhood through public consultation and just from having community service staff in the community. And in that case, groups that maybe don't have the savviness to be incorporated or to be, that are not as organized can actually partner with the city, and we can help them sort of navigate through that process to get those projects off the ground.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Deputy Mayor McKenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Emily. I think, it's an opportunity for us because as the mayor often says, there's only so much land, they're not making any more of it. So when we're given the opportunity to use provincial or federal land or private land for the public good, as long as all the checks and balances are in place legally, I think it's a great opportunity, and I think it's something that we'll probably see more of in other communities because, like I say, as population moves in and your land starts, you need to look around. So I think it's a great idea, fully in favor of it, and I would move the recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, one last wrap up, Councillor Harris.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to clarify with one unique example. Let's say I've got a group of parents and we've got a bunch of kids. And there's this field the city no longer owns, but it's sitting there. And we come up with this proposal for maintenance on this field to keep its current status, but we don't have an incorporated entity. We're not part of an organization, but as an actively used field. Would this group of parents be able to navigate or reach out to the city to get an application involved without that incorporated status? For say some upgrades on the field, some additional stuff to continue the work they're doing, or would they need to get that incorporation effort and that organizational effort done first? Just trying to, for my purposes, so I can know to tell people, no, do contact the city, or no, you are not ready to contact the city yet because you need these things in place. Just curious.
Yeah. It's an excellent question and one that we've debated internally. And what we would recommend is that group partner with an incorporated entity. And we have multiple incorporated groups that they can contact the city, they can contact community services, and we will help them partner with someone.
Got it. So like even like a community center that currently exists could rally with that. Okay.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
and I mean, we also do have to consider in the chance of a field, there does need to be a maintenance plan, and Play SJ obviously would be consulted. We do have, the Play SJ recommends that we have a certain amount of fields per neighborhood. So all of those things are being considered.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. I really love this expansion of this. I've known some West Siders that have already taken advantage and have benefited greatly off of this for dog and undog related reasons. But this is great, you guys. I really appreciate all the hard work that went into this. So now I'm going to make a motion that the Growth Committee recommends to Common Council that Common Council adopt the following updated land for public purposes policy statement. The City of St. John's Land for Public Purposes policy ensures alignment with provincial legislation and a process to utilize available funds through the provision of money in lieu of land through the development approval process in support of recreation, park space, and wellness in St. John. Can I get a mover? It's been moved by the deputy and now seconded by Councillor Harris. And on the question, all in favor? Great. Okay. Motion passed. And now, thank you everyone for attending our probably longest growth committee meeting we've ever had since I've been here. I appreciate your patience, and I will take a motion to adjourn. Mayor Riordan and Councillor Lowe. And on the question, all right. Have a great